Cora May hadn't planned on becoming a mother at 19, and she certainly hadn't expected to give birth alone in the back room of her cousin's trailer, a rusted-out shack just off Highway 61 in Mississippi, with a stained mattress and one flickering lamp for company. Her boyfriend, Jace, had already disappeared 2 months earlier, off chasing another town, another girl, or another high. She didn't bother asking which. By the time her water broke, she'd been living off dollar store crackers and half a can of beans a day, her body frail, face sunken, feet swollen from walking everywhere since her cousin booted her out. But when the baby came, screaming and slippery and small, something inside her cracked wide open. It wasn't the pain. It was the sound, that sharp, clean cry that seemed to cut straight through the grime and the heat and the rot of everything she'd been through. She named him Elijah. She didn't have a last name she wanted to give him, and none that would have meant anything anyway. She wrapped him in the only clean towel she had and held him all night, singing broken lullabies her mama once hummed in better days before cancer ate her up. By morning, reality returned like a slap. No money, no formula, no diapers, no home. The baby slept with his mouth open like he was still inside her, trusting her with every breath. And she couldn't even give him milk. She walked to the town square, shoes torn, carrying Elijah close. Every glance felt like judgment. She stopped at the church, but the door was locked. At the gas station, the cashier gave her a look like she was stealing air just by standing there. And then, outside the Greyhound station, she met them. A man and woman in their late 30s, clean, polite, and from out of town, you could smell it on them. The woman's makeup didn't sweat. The man wore leather shoes, even though it was nearly 100 degrees out. They approached gently, asking if she was okay. Then the questions got more pointed. Was the baby hers? Was she alone? Was she safe? And then the man said, softly, almost kindly, "We've been praying for a child. We have the means. We just want to help." Cora's stomach turned. It was like they'd been waiting for her. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a white envelope, thick and neatly sealed. $300, she said. It's not a purchase. It's a blessing for all of us. Cora froze. Her hands clutched Elijah tighter. He's not for sale, she muttered, but the words were sand in her mouth. The baby stirred, whimpering. Her breast had gone dry 3 days ago. She had no way to feed him, not even a clean place to lie him down. She stepped back, then forward, then sat on the curb and cried. The woman crouched next to her. "You can't raise him like this," she whispered, stroking Elijah's head. "Let us give him a life." Something inside Cora broke, not from pressure, from hopelessness. She looked into her baby's face one last time. He had her mouth and his father's nose, and she kissed his forehead so long it left a faint red mark. "If he ever asks, tell him I didn't want this," she whispered. The man took the baby with surprising tenderness. The woman placed the envelope on Cora's lap, and then they walked away, baby and all. She sat on the sidewalk until it rained. Didn't open the envelope. Didn't move. Just sat, soaked and shivering, empty arms wrapped around her hollow stomach. 3 months later, she tried to trace the couple. There were no names, no license plates, no files. Just a face in her memory and a scream she could still hear when she closed her eyes. Over the next 4 decades, she never had another child. She drifted between shelters, rehab programs, and minimum wage jobs, always keeping to herself, always carrying the ghost of the boy she sold. At 58, she was finally clean, working nights at a laundromat and living in a halfway home. No one knew her secret. No one asked, until one afternoon, on her way home from work, she passed the county courthouse and saw the banner, honoring 10 years on the bench, Judge Elijah Barrett. She stopped mid-step. The name hit her like a gut punch. Her heart began to hammer, chest tightening like she'd been thrown in ice water. "Barrett," she whispered it again, and again, then stumbled forward, gripping the iron railing, staring up at the building. There was a photo on the banner, too. A tall black man in a robe, clean-cut, serious eyes. Something about his face, his mouth. Her mouth. She whispered his name out loud, and the sound of it shattered her. Elijah. Her Elijah. 40 years vanished in a single blink, and she collapsed to her knees on the courthouse steps, her hands trembling like an addict in withdrawal as the world spun around her. She had sold her son, And now, he held the power to judge her. After the banner faded into the blue sky and the courthouse doors swallowed her memory, Cora May couldn't move. The name Elijah Barrett, repeated in her head like a bell toll, slow and cruel, ringing through every hidden corner of her past. She hadn't heard the name Elijah since that day. The day she handed over her son in exchange for $300 and a whispered promise that he would be loved. That money had burned like poison in her purse. She never spent it. She buried it behind the trailer in a tin box until a flood came through 2 years later and washed everything away. Her belongings, her hiding place, her will to keep pretending she was fine. In the months after giving up the baby, she had tried to track down the couple. It said they were from Baton Rouge, but no one in any adoption office had their names. She didn't even know their last names, and no paperwork had ever been filed. Back then, unofficial adoptions, if you could even call them that, were whispered about but never followed up on, especially in small towns like hers, where girls like her were expected to disappear quietly. And she had. After one failed call to child services ended with her being told there was no record of any Elijah born on that date in that county, she'd stopped asking. The shame buried her. The memory followed. She would hear a baby cry in a grocery store and freeze. On one occasion, she walked up to a woman with a toddler and asked, "What's his name?" with a wild gleam in her eye, heart pounding, even though she knew it couldn't be him. She moved towns, then states. She picked up habits to numb it. Cheap vodka, cheap men, anything to blur the image of his little hand grasping her pinky that last morning. She slept on park benches in shelters, and once for 3 months in a dry drainage pipe in Missouri. She sobered up at 41, relapsed at 42, got clean again at 45, and stayed that way. She kept her head down, worked nights wiping tables at a 24-hour diner, and lived in the kind of boarding house where no one asked questions. But even when her hands stopped shaking from withdrawal, her soul never did. She'd missed his first words, his first steps, his scraped knees and report cards. She used to imagine what kind of man he became. Was he gentle? Did he laugh often? Did he ever wonder about her? Or hate her? 40 years is a long time to live with silence. Then one night, back in her hometown for the first time in decades, she got arrested. Not for drugs, not for theft, but for something that surprised even her. She'd been standing in line at a soup kitchen when she saw a younger woman being pushed and berated by a man, her boyfriend, maybe. No one intervened, but Cora did. She stepped in, told him to back off, and when he swung, she punched him with the full weight of 40 years of fury. He called the cops. They took her in. No one pressed charges, but she was charged with misdemeanor assault and trespassing. "You'll be seen by a judge within 48 hours, the officer told her. She nodded blankly. It wasn't her first time behind bars, but it was the first time in over a decade. She sat in the holding cell with 8 other women, none of whom made eye contact, all of whom looked as tired as she felt. But her mind wasn't on the charge. It was on the banner, the name, the man in the robe. Could it really be him? What were the odds? Elijah wasn't a common name, not where she came from. And Barrett wasn't hers, but it could have been given by whoever took him. Could a boy born in that dark room all those years ago, handed over like a burden, really have risen to that kind of height? A judge? It seemed too cruel or too miraculous, depending on how you looked at it. She didn't dare believe it until they called her name in the courtroom. She shuffled into the arraignment chamber in an orange jumpsuit 2 sizes too big, ankles shackled, hair gray and wild around her face. The courtroom was stark and clean, and seated above them all, in the high chair with the nameplate etched in gold, was a tall man in black robes. His skin was the same shade as the baby she'd once held. His posture was stiff, formal, but it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They weren't cold. They weren't angry. They were scanning her, studying her, almost searching for something. He looked down at his paperwork, then up at her again. Their eyes met, and in that moment, it was as if the air had been sucked from the room. Cora's knees buckled. She fell forward slightly, grabbing the edge of the table. One of the guards caught her elbow, thinking it was a feint. But it wasn't fainting. It was remembering. It was realizing. It was all of it, crashing into her at once. Elijah, her baby, the judge, and she was standing before him, shackled, about to be sentenced by the child she'd once surrendered on a sidewalk with tears on her cheeks and blood still on her legs. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But she just stood there, locked in the gaze of a man she had given away. And now, perhaps, she would learn what he had become and what he thought of her. Elijah Barrett had always been told he was chosen. That's what his adoptive mother called it, chosen, a word dressed up in meaning, yet vague enough to keep his childhood questions just out of reach. His earliest memories were pristine, almost unnaturally so, gleaming hardwood floors, private tutors, shiny shoes that never stayed scuffed for long. His father, Douglas Barrett, was a firm man, not unkind, but emotionally impenetrable. His mother, Lenora, was softer, yet always rehearsed, like a woman playing the role of mother without quite knowing the lines. They never lied outright, but every answer Elijah received growing up felt like a half-painted portrait, blurry around the edges. He was told his biological mother had died during childbirth. He was told he was special, that they saved him from a life of hardship. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, Elijah would wake up from a recurring dream of being wrapped in something yellow, the scent of iron and old laundry lingering in the air, and a woman's voice, raw, hoarse, singing off-key through tears. When he was 11, he found a photo tucked into an old leather-bound Bible in his mother's closet. It wasn't labeled, and it wasn't framed. It was a picture of a young woman, barely more than a girl, holding a newborn on a street curb. Her eyes were wild with grief, and her hands were clutching the baby like someone about to drown. Elijah stared at it for hours, then slid it back where he found it, but he never forgot that face. He kept it in his mind the way some boys kept baseball cards. After law school, after passing the bar, and long after his parents passed away in a car crash when he was 28, he found the photo again in a safe box, along with an old yellow blanket and an envelope. Empty, water-stained, with no return address. That night, he drank half a bottle of bourbon and wept for the first time in his adult life, though he didn't quite know why. He had made peace, or thought he had, with the mystery of his beginnings. He buried it beneath his robes, his rulings, his respectability, until the woman in orange walked into his courtroom. At first, she was just another defendant, one of hundreds who passed through his docket each month. Misdemeanor assault, trespassing, elderly, gray-haired, worn down to the bone. But then he saw her eyes. There was something volcanic in them, something ancient and unresolved. And her name, Cora May. He whispered it once under his breath, like a test. Something clicked. He looked back at the old photo that night, holding it under his desk lamp. It couldn't be, could it? He had her file pulled. Just protocol, he told himself. He wasn't doing anything unethical, just clarifying. Her history read like someone who had clawed her way out of hell with her fingernails. Addiction, homelessness, periods of institutionalization. No next of kin, no children listed, but her age lined up, and so did the hometown. He felt his stomach drop. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he found himself pacing his apartment, pacing the lines of his own memory, looking for something, anything, that might explain this gravitational pull toward stranger. The next day, when he entered the courtroom, she was already seated. When she looked up and their eyes met, something passed between them, something unspoken yet thunderous. Elijah sat on the bench, holding his gavel in a hand that trembled slightly. He conducted the hearing with the same stern clarity he always had, but inside, a storm was tearing open every part of his identity. Who was she to him? Was she the woman from the photo? Was she the dream voice that had haunted his childhood nights? She said nothing, not even when she was asked to speak, not even when given a chance to defend herself. She simply looked at him, not like a criminal to a judge, but like a mother to a son. The hearing ended. Bail was set. The courtroom emptied, and Elijah sat alone, staring at the door she had just been escorted through. He didn't know what came next. Didn't know if he should recuse himself, confront her, avoid her altogether. But he did know one thing. He needed the truth. That night, alone in his office, he wrote her a letter. A short one. No accusations. No demands. Just a question. Did you name me Elijah? He had it delivered to her holding cell the next morning. And he waited, barely breathing, until her reply came, scribbled in shaky handwriting on the back of the same piece of paper. Asterisk yes. I named you Elijah. I held you all night. I never stopped hearing your cry. Asterisk Elijah folded the note and placed it inside the yellow blanket. He sat for hours, the two objects cradled in his lap, a judge crumbling under the weight of a case he never expected to hear, his own. Cora May had never written anything that mattered. Not since she'd left school in 10th grade. But that one sentence she scrawled on the back of the judge's note came from a place deeper than education, deeper than memory. It came from bone, from something maternal that had never died inside her, even when everything else had. Asterisk yes. I named you Elijah. I held you all night. I never stopped hearing your cry. Asterisk she handed it back to the guard with shaking fingers. No idea what would happen next. But in her chest, for the first time in 40 years, there was a flicker of something more than fear, something close to release. Across the courthouse, Judge Elijah Barrett sat alone in his chambers with the yellowed baby blanket folded neatly on his lap, staring down at the response he had both prayed for and dreaded. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, but the words struck like thunder in his gut. He didn't cry. He didn't even breathe for a long moment. Just sat there while the past rearranged itself in the silence of that office. His name wasn't a coincidence. His life wasn't an accident. And the woman in that cell wasn't just another face in a courtroom. She was his beginning. He thought of all the Sunday school mornings when he'd stared at the faces of other kids and wondered why he didn't look like anyone else. He thought of his adoptive father's discomfort around emotion, the quiet way his mother had deflected any questions about the early days. And then he thought of the photo in that old Bible, the girl on the curb, the one who held her baby like she was preparing to be haunted. That girl had grown into the woman who now sat in his jail. His mother, and he had power over her. The gavel had never felt so heavy. For the rest of the day, Elijah moved like a ghost through the halls of the courthouse, nodding at clerks, responding to cases, but his mind was submerged beneath a tidal wave of conflict. What would justice even mean here? Could he sentence her? Should he? She'd broken the law, yes. But she had also lived in a kind of prison far worse than the one she now occupied. That night, he didn't go home. He sat in his office long after the janitors left, staring out the window at the city lights, the blanket still in his hands. Around midnight, he wrote again. This time, he wrote more than a sentence. He wrote a letter. He told her about the blanket, that he'd had it all his life, that his adoptive mother kept it in a cedar chest, and said it was the only thing he had from the before. He told her about the photo and how he used to stare at the face in it and wonder if it was real. He told her about the name, that his parents had kept it because he looked like an Elijah. He asked her what she remembered, what she thought of him now. He didn't sign it, Judge. Just Elijah. When a letter reached her in the cell the next day, Cora didn't speak for a full hour. She held the page against her chest and closed her eyes. It was more than she had ever hoped for, more than she deserved, she thought. She wrote back, in trembling pen strokes, that she'd named him Elijah after the preacher who buried her mother, that he was born during a thunderstorm, with nothing but a flickering light and a threadbare towel to dry him off, that she had tried to keep him, that she never stopped trying, not really, but the world had been harder than she was. She told him she never spent the money, that she lost in a flood and took it as a sign that some things should not be bought or sold. She signed it your mother, if I still get to say that. Elijah read her letter 3 times. The next morning, instead of presiding over her sentencing, he quietly requested a reassignment, citing a personal conflict of interest. Another judge would determine her fate, but Elijah was in the gallery that day, seated in the last row, watching. Cora shuffled into the courtroom in her orange jumpsuit, her gray hair tied back, her eyes darting across the room. When she saw him, she stopped walking. The courtroom was silent. She didn't smile. Neither did he. But their eyes met, and in that gaze lived 1,000 words no language could hold. The new judge asked if there were any statements from a court. Elijah stood. Everyone turned. He walked to the front and faced the bench, not as a judge, but as a man, as a son. And for the first time in his life, Elijah Barrett spoke not from the law, but from his blood. Your Honor, he said, voice steady but quiet. This woman before you is my biological mother. 40 years ago, she gave me up. She had no means, no home, no help. What she did may have been illegal, but it was also, in some ways, an act of sacrifice. And I believe she has served her sentence every day since. The room was breathless. Cora covered her mouth with both hands, tears pouring from her eyes like confession. The judge stared down at Elijah, stunned. After a pause, he spoke. "Thank you. That will be noted." Cora was sentenced to 6 months of community service in order to attend a rehabilitation counseling program. No jail time. As the court recessed, Elijah walked out into the light, not knowing what the next chapter would bring, only that it had already begun. Cora was not let out in cuffs. She walked out on her own, head high, letter clutched in her hand. Neither said anything to the other as they passed through the courthouse doors. But she paused, just for a moment, turned to him and whispered, "I'm proud of you." He didn't answer, but he reached into his pocket, pulled out the yellow blanket, and handed it to her. For the first time in 40 years, she held her son again, not in arms, but in something that never left him. The cloth that had once wrapped a newborn now wrapped forgiveness. And that was how they began again. Cora didn't sleep that night. The courtroom echo still rang in her ears, louder than any prison door had ever sounded. When Elijah had spoken, when he had stood up not as a judge, but as a son, her knees nearly gave out beneath her. She had expected judgment, but what she got was a voice, gentle and calm, explaining the pain she'd once caused without crucifying her for it. She held onto those words as tightly as she clutched the yellow baby blanket, now folded on her bunk, her cell silent, but her mind roaring with memories. She hadn't cried this much since the day she gave him up. Her hands kept running over the soft threads of the blanket like they were rosary beads, as if every fiber might carry back the sound of his newborn breath, the heat of his tiny body against her chest. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know if she'd see him again, but she knew now that he had a name because she gave him one, that he had a life because she stepped aside, and that, somehow, she wasn't forgotten. That alone felt like a miracle. Her community service started the following Monday. She was assigned to a neighborhood food pantry on the east side of town, the same kind of place she used to beg for extra rolls and bruised bananas. Now, she handed out cans of beans and dented soup tins with a smile and a name tag that read Cora. Some of the volunteers were young girls, troubled, guarded. Cora saw herself in all of them. One of them asked if she had any kids. Cora paused, then said softly, "Yes." Ido. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. Every morning after that, she showed up early. On week 3, a black SUV parked outside. She didn't see who got out, but when she turned around at the donation table, Elijah was standing there. Not in robes, not in a suit, just in jeans and a gray sweater, holding a bag of non-perishables. "They said you needed volunteers," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes heavy. For a moment, they just stood there, both stunned by the ordinariness of the moment, the miracle of it. Then she nodded. "You ever stack pasta sauce?" she asked. "Badly," he replied. They worked side by side that afternoon, in silence mostly. But silence didn't hurt anymore. After a while, Elijah spoke. "I kept the photo. I used to wonder if it was real." She looked up from a box of rice. "It was." He nodded, then added, "I had dreams of a song, of crying. I never told anyone. Thought it was just noise." She smiled faintly. "You cried so loud. I sang just to keep us both from falling apart." They didn't hug. They didn't cry. But they stayed late, cleaning up together, putting chairs away, sweeping crumbs into a dustpan neither wanted to let go of. As they walked out to their cars, his new and sleek, hers borrowed and coughing, they paused in the parking lot under a flickering streetlight. "You know," he said, "my birthday's next month." She raised an eyebrow. "You want a cake or an apology?" He laughed, a real full laugh. "Maybe both," he said. "Maybe just lunch?" She blinked slowly, then smiled. "I like that." 1 month later, they sat at a tiny diner off Route 12, the kind where the menus are sticky and the waitresses remember your name. They talked for hours. He asked about her life, before, after, and everything in between. She answered honestly, never sparing herself, never asking for pity. In return, he shared things no one else knew. His loneliness, his fears, how every victory felt hollow without understanding where he came from. I used to hate the idea of her, he said. My birth mother. I used to imagine she left me in an alley. I needed that version to succeed. I didn't want to believe someone could give me away and still love me. Her lips quivered. I did love you. It nearly killed me to let go. But I didn't know how to be the mother you deserved. Maybe you were, he said. Maybe letting go was the only right thing you could do. They sipped coffee, both staring out the window. And in that silence, the years between them didn't vanish, but they softened. Over the next few months, they met every Sunday. Sometimes for church, sometimes for lunch, sometimes just to sit on a park bench and watch families go by. Slowly, gently, something unspoken began to grow, an understanding, a rhythm, a tentative kind of love. Elijah never called her mom. Not yet. But he didn't call her ma'am anymore either. Just Cora. And sometimes, hey, with a grin that felt like forgiveness. When his first child was born 2 years later, a daughter with deep brown eyes and lungs just as strong, he handed the baby to Cora in the hospital room. Meet your grandmother, he said, voice cracking for the first time. Cora held the baby like a treasure she never thought she'd touch again. She didn't cry. Not then. She just whispered, "Welcome," as if she were speaking to something sacred. In the years that followed, she never missed a birthday, a recital, a family dinner. She still wore that old food pantry name tag, laminated now and framed on her wall, as a reminder of where things had turned. Of how, even after the most devastating choices, something good could still come. The blanket? She kept it in a shadow box beside the hospital bracelet from the day he was born. And every year, on the night before Elijah's birthday, she took it out, held it against her chest, and whispered the same off-key lullaby she had sung 42 years before on a rainy night with no light, no help, only love, and a baby who cried loud enough to be remembered forever. Time didn't erase the past, but it softened its edges, dulled the sharp corners, and made room for something Cora never expected, a future with her son. In the 4 years since their quiet reunion, life hadn't suddenly become a fairy tale, but became real, grounded, fuller. Cora kept showing up at the food pantry, long after her mandatory hours ended. The people there began to look at her not with suspicion, but with trust. She became a sort of neighborhood mother, braiding the hair of teenage girls before job interviews, slipping extra snacks to kids who reminded her of Elijah at 5. She never asked for recognition, but they gave it to her anyway. The pantry framed a plaque for her that read, "Cora May, here since before the healing started." It made her laugh and cry in the same breath. Meanwhile, Elijah never spoke about her publicly, not because he was ashamed, but because what they were building felt sacred, something too fragile for courtrooms and headlines. But privately, she became part of his life. He started calling her on weekends, sometimes just to hear her voice. She learned how to use a smartphone, so she could send him photos, sunsets, the pantry garden, her cat sleeping upside down. He never said, "I love you." Not yet. But every visit, every dinner, every long walk was a word and a sentence they were still learning how to speak. Cora never asked for more. She had never been given the luxury of expecting anything. But slowly, piece by piece, her heart began to trust that he wouldn't vanish. Then came the letter. It was from the state board. Elijah had been nominated for a Judicial Ethics Award, an honor rarely given to active judges. In the submission form, someone had written a paragraph about how he had recused himself from a deeply personal case to protect the integrity of the court, despite that case being the single most defining story of his life. He chose justice not only for others, it read, but for himself. Cora never found out who submitted it. Maybe it was a clerk. Maybe it was someone who sat in that courtroom and felt the electricity when Elijah stood for her. Either way, it happened. And at the ceremony, when he took the stage in a black tuxedo and thanked those who had shaped his life, his voice broke as he reached the end. "And to the woman who gave me life, and then gave me a chance at something more, thank you. I see you now." In the front row, wearing a borrowed dress and holding her breath, Cora silently mouthed the words back. "I see you too." That night, after the applause faded and the cameras were off, Elijah found her backstage. She was picking at a plate of fruit, clearly overwhelmed, unsure of where to stand or what to say. He tapped her gently on the shoulder. She turned, startled, and before she could speak, he wrapped his arms around her. Firm, safe, real. It was the first time he hugged her. Not out of obligation. Not for show. Just because he wanted to. She held him like a lifeline. And for a moment, they stopped being judge and felon, orphan and ghost. They were just mother and son. That spring, Elijah invited her to move closer. Not into his home, but into the same neighborhood. He helped her get approved for senior housing in a small brick unit just a few blocks away from his place. She started babysitting his daughter on Thursday afternoons. They baked banana bread together. Cora taught the toddler how to sing lullabies, even though her voice cracked in places. "She sings like you did," Elijah said once, smiling. "Off-key and way too loud." Cora laughed, so hard she cried. But the moment that stayed with her most didn't happen in a courtroom or a ceremony. It happened one quiet afternoon when she was cleaning out old boxes and found a single photo, faded but still clear. It was her, 18, on that curb, holding baby Elijah wrapped in a yellow towel, her face crumpled in silent agony. She stared at it for a long time, then tucked it in a new frame, wrapped it in brown paper, and brought it to Elijah's house the next day. "For your office," she said, placing it on his desk. He looked at it, long and hard, then nodded. This is where the story starts." "No," she said softly. "This is where it didn't end." On her 63rd birthday, Elijah surprised her with a scrapbook titled 40 Lost Years. Inside were photos of her with his daughter, newspaper clippings about her food pantry work, a snapshot of them stacking cans side by side, and, on the last page, a letter he'd written but never sent. Asterisk, "I forgive you. Not because I have to, because I want to, and because you were the first person who ever loved me, even when you couldn't keep me." Asterisk, she traced the words with her fingertips. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. He kissed her on the forehead. "I know." That night, Cora sat on her porch under the stars.